Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you the BFA Raid Healing Post-Mortem, a review of the fights, the raids, everything from the last from this expansion, what I liked and didn't like. Starting it off, I wanted to start talking about Uldir. The very beginning, resources are ridiculously scarce, and in some cases, a lot of times, we're looking at how we're figuring out how to play the classes based off class changes, but also based off of, what we're learning and what the new fights are going to be throwing at us. One of the biggest things in Uldir was just the scarcity. There's so much scarcity at the beginning of an expansion, and that really impacts a healer core quite heavily when you also have to look at how you're going to be able to heal these different encounters with very little mana, very little resources. And that really started to bring up, heavier use out of Mistweaver, but really strong use out of Resto Druid at the start as well. These are, two classes that are generally not at the top echelon or considered to be at the top echelon, for example, and they really started stepping up in terms of representation. I think Druid more than most because of just how incredibly powerful 2-minute Tranquility was and how incredibly useful it is to have these raid cooldowns where you can just have your healers use some filler spells and use some just little light casts here and there while it's going, and Tranquility can kind of just fully carry you throughout that period. Discipline was also ridiculously powerful, but again, that's nothing new. One of the most interesting things is that the beginning of the expansions always seem to be those periods of time where they can be a lot more balanced in terms of which healers get some kind of representation relative to what we saw at the end of it, right? There's never going to be any perfect balance of, every healer gets brought to the world first race at every single point, every single encounter. But when we got to look at different fights like Vectis, and even many parts of Cahoon, they turned into really heavy attrition encounters, where you'd start seeing, we just need to be able to live through these things. It's not, while damage reduction is valuable, we also need really heavy throughput to make sure that we're going to be able to survive. And at that point, the double cooldowns that you will get, for example, out of a Holy Priest, the 2-minute Tranquility, having rapid access to raid-wide cooldowns that have tremendous effects makes it a lot easier to be able to force efficiency by having healers go into periods of low uptime and, not really exerting much in terms of spending a lot of their mana, and making it much easier for the overall raid CDs to sort of carry them. And that's how I felt a lot of Uldir ended up going for us, was just lean on those raid CDs, try to avoid, especially taking any extra damage, because yeah, you might be able to heal through it and you're not going to get one shot by an ability, but you go more rapidly, and when you have no mana, you're not going to be any sort of help to the rest of the raid. Looking at Battle for Dazara lore, the tier was also a bit of Tale of Two events going on. You had a lot of attrition fights, as we talked about with Uldir, but you also had a lot of just heavy mechanical sort of pass-fails that would go on throughout. So making sure that you were able to set up areas that would avoid taking extra damage, right? There's a lot of splash cleave that was going to be going on, especially like we see here with King Rastakhan going forward. Making sure that you're able to set up a lot of mechanics so that you're not having to move as much, making sure that you're setting it up so that you can min-max a lot of your damage, for example. Many cases, it was making sure that you didn't die to certain mechanics, get to the end of the fight, and then you just let the boss go down on its own, right? When we started looking at Jaina, for example, this really started emphasizing a pattern that was established with fighting Cahoon, was that the first phases were just a lot of RP and was a lot of like setting the stage or setting a storyline, and then later on in the fight you actually have a lot of healing to do. So with Jaina, for example, you'd be mind controlling Marines, tossing them off the boats, and then making sure that you're playing ship's captain for pretty much the rest of that first phase. Really trying to min-max, your mana, your efficiency. We even had our raid going trolls so that we'd have a lower duration on our slowing effect over the course of that encounter. Jaina in particular was probably one of my least favorite fights of the expansion to progress on, because it was so low emphasis on healing for pretty much the hardest parts of the fight. Transitioning in the very beginning of those encounters and making sure that you're not dying early, you're staying with the group, everything like that, and doing that hundreds of times just gets immensely boring when there's not really much of a healing challenge that you have to go forward through it. But as we moved on into the rest of the fight, it went from a point of overwhelming and tremendous damage, and then you clear your debuffs and there's nothing, right? Not having a great level of in-between just kind of added a ton of shock value to this tier in terms of like the end of the encounter, because you had to have these overwhelming raid cooldowns at your disposal. For us, that meant double Resto Shaman, double Disc Priest, so that we would be able to have excellent ramps for key moments and key windows and be able to make sure we could survive them. Having the double Spirit Link Totem, even having like an Ankh Totem and stuff like that at our disposal through many parts of Battle for Dazar'alor was incredibly valuable, and this tier I think definitely emphasized that Shaman is able to step up, especially when people can find very creative ways to ensure your own survival. And well, I'd say overall this was probably one of my favorite raids of the expansion. The end boss definitely was not, and even going back and helping out with like Jaina kills and getting people their mounts and stuff, I'm kind of reminded by how long those early phases ended up taking and how frustrating it was having to deal with them. Unat does deserve some good consideration, as it was the, our mini tier of the expansion. It definitely wasn't, of course, a full-fledged tier or anything like that, but it did have probably one of my favorite end boss fights throughout. Unat combined a couple of different mechanics that I already really enjoyed, having to deal with like the Star Augur type of mechanics, making sure that you're able to stick together for that. There was a lot of emphasis, for example, on getting good gear out of BOD and making sure that we'd be able to sort of min-max that as best as we possibly could. Those things were always really fun, and to be quite honest, there was things to heal on Unat throughout the entirety of the encounter. We had to worry about your positioning, you had to worry about your teamwork, and while I was disappointed that it was a 3-heal encounter, as I firmly believe that all end bosses should be 4 or 5 heal encounters, it still was very nice to be able to have something to really do as you're progressing. I think too often this expansion, healers just had to kind of sit on the sidelines, had to wait for the RP, had to wait for the story that was ongoing, and thankfully, this tier was quite a bit different, or this mini tier was quite a bit different. Adding the extra element of friendly fire throughout was always very interesting. It really was quite unfortunate for like Glimmer Paladins or, Disc Priest with Atonement, and this was actually one boss where being able to have some hots that would continuously be ticking on players while you had to, while you were at this converted phase, while foes were going to be dealing, or allies would be dealing damage to each other. That was always something that was quite weird, but it also was a nice flavor that they added to those different specializations, and positioning and making sure you're min-maxing that was insanely important throughout. Unat, pretty cool fight overall, and I liked being able to make sure that you had the element of the lore going on, but it didn't really seem to overwhelm or take over or take anything away from the encounter itself. Now, as we go into the Eternal Palace, I mentioned how BOD started really ramping up how important damage reduction resources were at our disposal, and Eternal Palace exacerbated this by a million. And in many cases, Eternal Palace was really the reason that there's been a lot of panic going on throughout the healer community about adding damage. Throughout pretty much all of Eternal Palace, damage timers were ridiculously close, and there wasn't really any great way around it. Healers just needed to be able to contribute DPS to ensure that there would be that you'd be able to meet those checks, that you'd be able to kill ads quickly enough, that you'd be able to kill the boss quickly enough, that you'd make sure that you didn't get overwhelmed. Queen's Court is a great example of this, as is pretty much the last 3 bosses. Both Queen's Court, Zakul, and Ashara all had to have the element of damage checks, making sure that you were able to stop-start at the right times, but also just overwhelming emphasis on damage reduction resources, forcing double disc, double paladin throughout the tier. Even having shamans was useful, but not nearly as useful as it had been in Battle for Dazar'alor, because the element of just one-shot mechanics was so much more profound, and it made it a lot more difficult unless you were having, kind of Battle Shaman throughout. And this was one tier where Battle Shaman really did step up, but many cases it just wasn't as strong as having another Disc Priest, having another Paladin, really seeing how Holy Paladins were feeling Glimmer and the power that it was going to be bringing to them throughout. Paladin seemed pretty balanced throughout progression, but after progression, that post-farm era was where Holy Paladin just was destroying everybody that it got near. And that stuff always gets unfortunate, but what can you do at this point? It was just one Azurite trait that they thought would be cool and thought would be a little addition, and it turned out to be overwhelming power. That was way too good. As we got into Ashara, again, same element, overwhelming amounts of RP, waiting, not really being able to interact with the boss for almost half of the encounter in its entirety. I'm not really sure what happened with end boss design this expansion, but there was just such heavy emphasis on like trying to tell a story as you're fighting, you know, this great monster and this great enemy or something along those lines. And it definitely was not something that I, you know, like I've been saying, it's definitely not something I was enjoying. It definitely, you know, took away, I think, in many cases. When we look at a fight like Argus at the end of the expansion, yeah, there was definitely some elements of lore to it where, you know, you would get killed by Argus and A&R would resurrect you. You have to run back to your body or something like that. But you got back in the action so rapidly. The encounter started off as being empowered by those titans and everything like that. So I think in many cases they've, you know, gone too far into telling a story while you're fighting than making sure that those fights are going to be interesting. Eternal Palace had, in my opinion, one of like some of the best gameplay for healers, but that's only if you're playing a healer that really was able to DPS, heal, and contribute in many different ways all at the same time. If you couldn't, it was one of the worst ones out there, and it really made you feel it, which is incredibly unfortunate. It started drawing very straightforward lines in our community as to, do people like damaging? Do people like just only being a healer? And what really does make a healer? When we moved on to Ny'alotha, we never really got a chance to find out if that's a direction that Blizzard wants to go in, because corruption made any idea of being able to force healers to DPS, it just kind of completely went out the window. Damaging corruptions, even just applied to a healer, contributed so much extra damage that it really wasn't too much of a question as to whether or not healers would add damage. They just would naturally end up doing so depending on what corruptions that they had. I got handed an Infinite Stars corruption piece during progression, and just naturally by having it, it'd be my top damage on a lot of the encounters just because I was adding damage and smiting over the course of it. Going into N'Zoth, it was, again, another fight. Lots of RP, lots of not interacting with the actual boss itself until much later. This tier did a great job of actually trying to buck the curve that we saw out of Eternal Palace. Many times at the end of the expansion, fights become even more bursty. But while Ny'alotha and specifically N'Zoth did have some burst, they added so much overwhelming ticking damage to the encounter that you did need healers that could provide a steady amount of throughput over the course of it to make sure that people are able to survive. As you're seeing guilds now 3-healing N'Zoth, they still need to make sure that they adjust how they're playing in some specific areas, because the rot damage from N'Zoth himself is still very high. I think that Ny'alotha did a tremendous job of trying to, one, make sure that healers weren't forced into DPSing if they didn't want to, while also making sure that there were clear, large benefits for those very hardcore players who did enjoy doing it and who wanted to be able to contribute in every sort of way. It did it in a great way that did not prevent holy priests or shamans or classes, basically any spec that wasn't a paladin or a disc priest. It allowed those specs to get more representation. And while there was tremendous opportunity for Mistweaver to see some heavy gameplay in a lot of these fights, because the high haste build wasn't really known at that point, and because it was just luck of the draw as to whether or not you'd be able to put it together even if you did know about it, Monk pretty much was, I'd say, the loser of progression Ny'alotha, because it just really wasn't able to put together enough throughput, enough utility, enough value to be justified in an ultra hardcore environment over some of the more meta specs and meta classes going forward. So what this means, I think, for Shadowlands is they really got to look at how they're designing some of these end boss fights. And while they did make sure that N'Zoth was a fun fight to heal, they also got to look at how we're actually interacting with these enemies. 2 of the end bosses in Jaina and Ashara we never actually killed. They just came back and did something else with the storyline. N'Zoth we do get to end up killing, but not really by our hands. It's, you know, other people interacting around us rather than, oh, with the help of the Titans, we killed Argus, right? Let me know what you guys think, and let me know what you kind of want to see differently for Shadowlands. For me, top of the list is just making sure that there's not an overwhelming amount of a prologue or leading us into these encounters, but rather we get into the nitty-gritty of having some heavy healing, having some, you know, larger, if they're going to be long fights like they pretty much always are for end bosses, let's make sure that we have something to do, you know? Make sure that we have something to do, and I'm very much looking forward to Shadowlands to see what Castle Nathria is going to bring us, specifically because the beginning of expansions, it's all about efficiency with your raid cooldowns. Later on in expansions, especially in Ny'alotha, we were more than happy to overwhelm certain problem periods with a disc ramp and a raid cooldown at the same time. Those sort of things came forward and made life a lot easier to just push so much throughput, even if it overhealed, to make sure that you survive something. When we go into the next expansion, at the very beginning, efficiency of cooldowns is usually the way that it goes, but I can't wait to start getting into some of the testing. Let me know what you guys think. Sorry for all the delays of getting more YouTube content rolling, but we're going to try to get ourselves back on a good schedule very soon. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Love your faces, and I'll see y'all next time.